Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking a bit about the books that I've read this week, and in some ways kind of the week before a bit as well, because I was away last week dog sitting and therefore kind of didn't really get a chance to sort of film a proper video for that. So there'll be a couple of books left over from last week, a few that will basically be covered in other videos anyway, so I'm not going to dwell on them really here, and then a few that I've read this week. So let's get started. First up, one of the books I read last week, and a book that I've been meaning to read for the longest time, which is In the Dream House by Carmen Machado, and I adored this. This completely blew me away because I was expecting a very, very different book, I think. I'd heard really rave reviews about it, but knew almost nothing about the actual book itself. So essentially, long story short, this book is a bit of a sort of memoir to some degree of Carmen Machado looking back over a relationship that was abusive and really quite complicated in so many ways. And that itself would have made an excellent book, I think. You know, she writes really beautifully and really powerfully about so many of the things that happened to her. But what I think elevates this even further is that she takes this idea of the dream house, this sort of magical scenario or the kind of good outcome or everything that's happening with her, and she sort of looks at various sort of almost TV and film and book tropes to tell that. So for example, just flicking through the first few here, so Dream House as Meet the Parents, the film, Dream House as Road Trip to Everywhere, Dream House as Daydream, as an exercise in point of view. And so we got all of these sort of different ways that she attempts to go back over her experience. And at one point, one of the bits that I found the most kind of heartbreaking and wonderfully rendered was where she does it as a choose your own adventure. And that at first sounds like it shouldn't work, talking quite deeply about domestic violence and sort of an abusive, difficult relationship through the idea of choose your own adventure. But what was so staggering was, you know, at one point it says, if you would make this decision, turn to this page. If you would leave, go to this page. If you would talk back to her, go to this page. And if you go to the page where you talk back, she says to you, you wouldn't do that. That's not what you would do here. And it's incredible. There's a real breaking of the fourth wall of her just reaching in and kind of saying, that's not what happened and that's not what could have happened. And in one fell stroke, she's not only crafting this incredible narrative, but she's also really challenging the very idea that that, you know, that often gets lobbed around when talking about these sorts of relationships, where people say, you know, why didn't you just leave? Why didn't you challenge whatever? And she kind of says, you couldn't. That's not what was available here. And actually, if you flick through, there are some pages that are not linked as part of that choose your own adventure. So like page 200 or whatever. And if you are on that page, she says, you're trying to read this book in a linear fashion. That's not what this is like. You're trying to break the rules here. You didn't have this option, so you can't choose it. And it's staggering. I kind of sort of, my jaw was on the floor with various parts of this book of like, how on earth did she craft something like this? But also, how did she take something so deep and dark and personal and turn it into something that's, you know, in one go, both an academic exercise, but also a really powerful explanation of everything that happened to her. So yeah, I just think this is a marvelous book, and I really want to read, I think is it Her Body and Other Parties, which I've heard incredible things about as well. Next up, keeping the theme of heartbreaking books, I read Miss Memory Lane by Colton Haynes. And this is a book that is essentially, I mean, I have to admit, I didn't know who he was, but I'd had it recommended when I spoke about Jeanette McCurdy's book, I'm Glad My Mum Died. And Colton Haynes' book, thank you, person in the comments who suggested this, because this was a fantastic read, and if, again, deeply, darkly challenging. So Colton Haynes, an actor known for, apparently, for Arrow and Teen Wolf, neither of which I've seen, which is not a surprise. I almost basically, I'm normally a good 10-15 years behind with TV. So I'll like, you know, like earlier this year, I finished watching Golden Girls, and I was like, oh, now I see what all the fuss is about. Uh, so, you know, at some point I'll watch some other stuff. Anyway, and this book, he talks a lot about his relationship, and he with his parents, and with his fame, with various other things. So he is a young man, realizing his sexuality quite young. He starts having sex with quite a lot of men while he's still quite young. I think he's about 14, while a lot of it's happening. And there's a really difficult family environment as well. His mother has various addictions, and he finds himself having similar ones down the line as well. And so he sort of has this life where he's so much of his life is dominated by his sense of beauty, and by people only really engaging with him in that way. So either sleeping with him because they find him attractive, or when he becomes a model and then an actor, about sort of being chosen or not chosen for parts, almost, you know, almost entirely because of the way he looks. And he starts to build quite a complicated relationship with his own self, with his identity, with how he feels about himself, but also in how he relates to others. He finds it really hard to be on, to kind of understand how to connect with people, because for so many people he hasn't almost built up those skills because he hasn't had to. He's been given things because he's beautiful, or he has been rejected from things because he's not seen as beautiful enough, and he's never had to really have to build some of these relationships. Everything's been quite transient. And this book towards the end just builds to this almost sort of poetic kind of this really poetic kind of ending of he really starts to, you know, he hits rock bottom in various ways, and he really starts to build himself back up. But in doing so, he has these really sort of visceral descriptions of sort of everything that's been going wrong with his body, with his life, with his relationships, and he is sort of picking up the pieces. And so it ends on this sort of hopeful note, but in a really, it's almost fire, like sort of this real kind of rage sort of burning through him at the end of this book, in terms of trying to work out how, you know, what he's going to do next. And I just thought this was a stunning read. On a lighter note, or at least I sort of want to say lighter, it's Annie Ernaux with The Possession. So we are now in November. Hello. And as I mentioned, the books I've suggested are ones that I've already read. So I'm kind of tinkering around and trying to read a few other Annie Ernaux books. But I hope people who have sort of started reading some of hers this month are really enjoying it. The Possession is a very, very short book, about 60 pages, and in which Annie Ernaux is basically looking back over her a relationship that she had, where there was essentially a lover of hers, and she finds out that there is another woman, that this lover of hers has another lover, and through tiny bits of information that she manages to find, so such as her rough age, a little bit about what she looks like, a little bit about some of her interests, we have this sort of almost not stalker-like, but really kind of strong determination from Annie Ernaux to work out who this woman is and to find her. And there's a real development through the book as she goes, where she sort of turns from the beginning being this possession, that in the book's title, of being possessed by this idea that she needs to find out who this woman is, and she must find out everything about her. And she phones random numbers and asks, you know, do you know this man? And she almost seems hell-bent on destroying this woman. And she comes to this realization throughout this book that that's not what needs to happen here. That's a really unhealthy way to be. But also, what does it matter? What does it matter if she destroys this woman? What does that change? And I just, in very typical Annie Ernaux fashion, is sort of wonderfully sort of suffused with sex and relationships, but also these sort of moments of real wisdom in kind of trying to understand her own sort of drives and instincts on some of these things, and recognizing that she's just been, you know, really led by her own insecurities. So I think it's just such a fun little book, this one. Next up, I read Fire Island by Jack Parlett. And this is basically a bit of a story of Fire Island itself. So an island which sort of for a while basically kind of had this really strong community, and it still does, but especially kind of in sort of certain periods of history, had a really strong population of sort of gay men and sort of queer men, and other queer people as well, but it sort of seemed to mostly be sort of gay and bi men, who would go to this island, and it sort of became this almost sort of pleasure palace, with all these bars and clubs, and it was one of the sort of earlier times, I guess, for the in the US, where people were just able to be safe and themselves in this sort of small community. You go to the island, you go and have these wild nights out, and it almost gets left on the island, and you get to go back to your normal life. But obviously, as with many periods of history for the US and for many other parts of the world, around the 70s and 80s, HIV and AIDS changed that, and so there's also this sort of burgeoning sense of activism within the area, but also something gets lost in that, where this once carefree island suddenly is no longer quite so carefree. And so it's sort of in many ways a bit of a history of how LGBTQ plus people were able to kind of find spaces and create spaces that worked as sort of little havens for them, but in this, on the same, by the same token, these sort of became places that were quite complicated in the kind of queer history, not only because in many cases many of the people who went were white and affluent, and actually there were many other parts of the community who were left out and who couldn't afford to go and do that and be themselves there. There were also, bits of violence happening where, because loads of people knew that there'd be queer people congregated in one area, lots of people also just kind of came over and took that as a chance to try and attack people or what have you. So it's this really kind of complicated history, and I think Jack Parlett does a really great job in pulling that together in quite a fun and interesting way, whilst not being too heavy on the historical detail. It's sort of, there's a bit of a personal narrative woven into this as well that I thought was really interesting. Next up, I read a book that I've been meaning to read for a little while, and finally kind of just took the plunge and got it from the library. I say took the plunge like that's a massive risk. And that is Attrib, and Other Stories by Eley Williams. And this is sort of a collection of these sort of short stories that feel quite interconnected, particularly around the idea of language, of playfulness around language, and sort of also linked by a bit of a unifying theme around etymology. Which sounds dry on the surface, but I think is handled really well here. So there are quite a few references to dictionaries and compiling definitions of things and how those things change. But what Attrib, I think, does really effectively is it uses that playfulness of language and doesn't just sort of stop there. It uses that to thread into the narrative of something deeper. So at one point there are definitions taking place of certain words, but in the meantime it looks like a lover is about to leave, and these words are sort of powerless to keep that lover there. At other times these words are there celebrating this lover and kind of creating these beautiful moments together. And so actually there's something so loving and fun and playful about this collection in the way it just sort of really brings your attention back to certain words, and I found it just utterly charming as a collection of stories. I sometimes struggle with short story collections, but for me this one, I think I paced it a little bit better. I took a bit more time with it, and I think I also just really enjoyed the kind of the unifying theme. So even if the stories are different, even if the characters in those stories are different, there's something that connects them quite neatly to each other, and it's just a little triumph of a book. It's really beautiful and really funny, but also incredibly poignant and sad where it needs to be as well. So yeah, really well done book. And last but not least, I read William Golding's Rites of Passage, winner of the 1980, I believe, Booker Prize. And so I am kind of going back and reading a few, obviously my wider, longer term project is reading all of the Booker Prize shortlists, including the winners. And I'm sort of realizing increasingly I'm getting closer to the end. I'm not obviously there yet. It's still a good 100 and something books, but getting there. And I kind of just thought, okay, sod it, let's give this a read finally. And what I've sort of found about it is sort of really not what I was expecting in many ways. You know, William Golding famously wrote Lord of the Flies, and so as a result was not quite sure where this book would fit alongside that. This is essentially a set of letters written by this young man whose name I've forgotten, Edmund, and he is writing back to his godfather. And so these letters start off full of these really playful stories of things happening on ship, and he's saying, oh well, I'm going to learn all the language that I need for like, ship speak, of like, what are all these sort of terms that I need to learn. And he slowly starts sort of adding them into the letters, and he seems to be having a good time at first. But as we go, he starts slowly losing track of the days. Each letter originally was numbered by the day, how many days he'd been at sea. And eventually he starts adding symbols and other letters, and numbers and random things, because he's lost where he is. But actually, what we start finding, that there's something more sinister happening in the background of this ship and of this voyage. And so indeed we start getting these little moments that not everything is quite as it seems. Things seem to be going quite wrong, and it sort of comes towards a bit of a conclusion with some really quite bizarre happenings. I didn't always fully get on with this, or kind of fully know where I was in the book. I kind of got a little bit lost at times, but it was still full of quite a lot of joy and silliness and fun, even if it's written all in this very kind of not necessarily antiquated style, but a very kind of almost, Victorian, higher God, the fact that I can't remember how to say this is probably even worse, isn't it? Kind of sort of highfalutin kind of speech, which almost adds to the kind of bizarreness of this book, because it's so flippant and, well, of course, well, I happened to chance upon this thing, and all of that kind of adds to the sort of this weird nature of what's going on, that things are about to fall down and break, and he's sort of like, sort of faffing around a bit. Anyway, so those have been some of the books that I read over the last sort of week and a half, 2 weeks. There were some others, but yeah, they're kind of being covered in either the Polari Prize video or the Goldsmiths video, or another Goldsmiths video that I'm going to be filming soon, reading the winners from the last 10 years. But these have been the books I read, and some real joys in there. I think In the Dream House is just one of the most incredible things I've ever read, and Attrib, I think, is just such a fun book that I just really enjoyed a lot. So really exciting, and I hope you've had a good week. I'm now without dog again, but had a really lovely time, even if one of my books got chewed by the dog. It's now got some. It was one of those books that I'm normally quite good at kind of either selling on or kind of getting rid of books, but now I kind of want to keep that book just because it's got some bite marks in it. And also that probably won't sell, but it has some bite marks in it. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking about dogs. I'm Bob. Thank you so much for watching. Take care, and I'll speak to you all soon. Bye bye.